Hello everyone, my name is Saklapi Paisanan. Today I would like to present my work with Frank Palik and Yasha Mofeki towards understanding neuroscience of realization of information need in light of relevance and satisfaction judgement. The presentation is organized in the following structure: introduction, background, research questions, method, results, conclusion, and future works. In information retrieval, there are a number of behavioral models of information search, such as the information search process, that demonstrate an information-seeking behavior of a searcher during performing information search activities. The information search process model demonstrates a holistic view of information seeking from a searcher perspective, represent feeling, thought, and action of a searcher across stages in the model. At the initiation stage, a searcher becomes aware of lack of knowledge or having a need of information. Then, in the exploration stage, the searcher needs to engage a search system in order to gather pieces of relevant information to fulfill their information need. The searcher then will experience a sense of satisfaction at the final stage, presentation, if their information need was fulfilled. There are three main elements that involved in the models of information search. The first element is the information need, which is a desire of a searcher to obtain information to satisfy their need. It is considered as a trigger and a driver of information-seeking behavior, which motivates searchers to engage an information retrieval system. The second element is relevance, which is the fundamental concept in information retrieval. It can be understood as the ability of an information retrieval system to retrieve material that can satisfy the needs of the users. In the information search process, the searcher needs to make relevant judgment on the documents individually regarding to his previous experience. The last element is satisfaction of information need. The concept of satisfaction has been widely studied across disciplines such as marketing, psychology, and economics. In the models of information search, the searcher is required to review a number of relevant documents that obtained from a search system to satisfy their information needs. So the transformation of the information need during a search is important to understand how searchers behave during performing an information search. In information retrieval, a fundamental question has been proposed as what are the psychological processes that engage when the state of information needs is transformed by a relevant search result, and then further transformed when the information need is satisfied. Traditional IR research generally address this question by using behavioral data that obtained from searchers when they were performing a search task. Recently, there is an emerging field in IR called neurosearch. The field utilizes the use of neuroimaging techniques to investigate brain activity of a searcher behavior during search activities. The previous works in the field include using fMRI technique to investigate brain regions that involve in process of information need and relevant judgment, and predicting term relevance using brain signal that capture from EEG and predicting image relevance using brain signal that capture from MEG. The previous work from Murphy and Pollock divide the entire search process into a set of time periods include the realization of information need, query formulation, query submission, relevance and satisfaction. They compare the brain activity between adjacent time periods of the search process from the beginning to the end of the search process in order to understand the evolution of brain activity and cognitive function across the different stages. However, they did not investigate how the brain activity involved in information need compared to the brain activity during relevance and satisfaction were just. This is considered as a critical point as the realization of information need is the most important event in initiating search, and comparison between a realization of information need and the time of relevance judgment and satisfaction judgment could inform how the information need is resolved. A common goal of neuroimaging research is to identify the mental processes that are engaged when a subject performs a mental task. There are two main types of inference that have been widely used in the neuroimaging research, including forward inference and reverse inference. Forward inference is to infer what brain activity or region that associate with a given experimental condition, and in reverse inference is to infer what cognitive process or behavior that occur when given the brain activity. The benefits of reverse inference is allow us to infer cognitive state that could share similar neural signature or internal psychological process that could not be measured. There is a tool called Neuroscience that designed to help us with this process. The Neuroscience collects a large corpus of articles and terms of scientific interest. The peak coordinates from the associated article are extracted from tables, and then a meta-analysis of the peak coordinate will be automatically performed. In this work, we have two main research questions to investigate. The first one is, what are the differences in brain activity between the time of a realization of information need and a relevant judgment, and what cognitive functions relate to these differences in brain activity, and what are the differences in brain activity between the time of a realization of information need and a satisfaction judgment, and what cognitive functions relate to these differences in brain activity. Ethical permission was obtained to conduct the experiment from the Ethics Committee from the College of Science and Engineering, University of Glasgow. A pilot study was conducted to ensure that the experimental procedure worked smoothly as expected. Before conducting the actual experiment, participants were instructed and given a training session. In the task, the participants engaged in two separate runs of the task. Each run comprised of 20 questions. The participants were given a break between the tasks to prevent the fatigue effects. After finishing the experiment, the participants were asked to complete the exit question in order to provide demographic and qualitative description of their experience toward the experiment. In our experiment, participants engaged in an experimental task imitating a search process. The participants were asked to respond a set of questions that gathered from the track question answering tracks. At the beginning of the task, the participants were presented with the question, then 4 possible answers were presented with the question. One of the answers was need to search. If the participant provide a response with need to search, we then label this time period as the realization of information need or IN. Then the participants were asked to formulate a query and submit the query. The document was randomly selected from 4 possible documents consisting of 2 relevant documents and 2 irrelevant documents. The participants were given a time period to evaluate the document. This impulse was labeled as the relevant judgment or RJ. Then they were returned to the beginning of the original question. If the next response was any answer except need to search, they were asked to rate their satisfaction with 2 possible responses, which were either yes or no. If the response was yes, this time period would be labeled as the satisfaction judgment or SJ. In this experiment, we examined brain activity of 24 subjects, including 11 males and 13 females. All participants were under the age of 44, and the majority of the participants were right-handed. The fMRI data collected in this experiment were pre-processed following the fMRI standard guideline. We then performed 2 contrasts, including IN versus RJ and IN versus SJ. Then we performed the large-scale functional brain network analysis in order to map the activation in the result to different brain networks. We also used the neuroscience to perform reverse inference in order to identify the psychological function that associate to the activation in the result. In the contrast of IN versus RJ, the results show 7 of 9 clusters had higher activation for RJ over IN, while 2 clusters have higher activation for IN over RJ. In the cluster that had higher activation for RJ, we found 4 of the 7 clusters in the default mode network and 2 of them in salience network and memory retrieval. The default mode network indicates that there is an access of internal information or could possibly arise from mind wandering. The results from the large-scale functional brain network analysis seem to be consistent with the results from the reverse inference. There are several psychological functions in the 7 areas where brain activity was greater for RJ, including working memory, semantic, language processing, social processing, and auditory processing. And also, there are psychological functions in 2 areas where brain activity was greater for IN, including imagery, attention, planning, calculation, somatosensory, action, working memory, and motor. This supports a view that the region associated with both cognition and motor function. For the contrast of IN versus SJ, the results show that 8 of 17 clusters had higher activation for SJ over IN. The other 9 clusters had higher activation for IN over SJ. In the cluster that had higher activation for SJ, we found single cluster in the salience, cinguloopercular, frontoparietal, memory retrieval, and sensory network, as well as 2 clusters in dorsal attention network. The results from reverse inference show that there are psychological functions when brain activity was greater for SJ, including somatosensory, motor, action, and pain. The insula is known to be involved in pain processing. This relationship between the insula and pain might overshadow other effective processing aspects of insula function. There are also psychological functions when brain activity was greater for IN, including conflict, imagery, attention, planning, calculation, semantic, working memory, auditory, and language processing. This indicates that the realization of information need involves a complex interplay of cognitive faculty. Participants may be require dynamic allocation of cognitive resource in order to generate an information need. Our findings in this study demonstrate characteristics of information need and how it relates to other concepts in information retrieval such as relevance and satisfaction. The interpretation of the findings shows the multifaceted nature of the realization of information need as its balance between assessing available internal source of information and assessing external source of information. Comparing the information need to both relevance and satisfaction provide evidence for a lateralized left hemisphere group of brain areas, indicating that the information need involves a dynamic reconfiguration of several brain networks. This insight could help us to understand the searcher behavior during a search process, which could be used in designing and improving the information retrieval system, and suggests that future research could investigate more deeply in detail of the dynamic process of the network that involved in the information need. And thank you so much.